Hi everyone. So today I will be talking about my research report in systemic racism against Canada's Indigenous people in accessing healthcare system. And for a little bit of introduction, there are at least 5% of people in Canada that are self-identified as Indigenous, and their life expectancy in these communities are shorter than all average Canadians. For example, Indigenous men life expectancy is 70.3 years compared to 79 years of all Canadians. And for Indigenous women, 77 years compared to 83 years for all Canadian women. And they are at higher risk of infections and diseases such as HIV infections, AIDS, STD, complications from diabetes, tuberculosis, and etc. Due to the lack of access in healthcare services, suicide rates in these Indigenous communities are increasing and is still increasing. And since, there are systemic racism going on in our healthcare system, Indigenous people are forced to seek help in Indian hospitals that can only provide them with substandard care. What is the purpose for my research report? My purpose is to raise awareness and educate the general population about what is going on in our healthcare system, about our Indigenous people, about them lacking resources for our healthcare, and convincing the government to stop cutting social funding for Indigenous communities that can improve their lifestyle, their sources of income, their sources of education. And this will propose equality in accessing healthcare system, since healthcare system should be universal and available for everyone. And lastly, this will address the root causes of racism inside healthcare system. Who is my main audience? It will be the policymaker. Why? Policymaker, they have the ability or they have the power to implement new laws that could benefit our Indigenous people. They can implement law that can propose anti-racism, anti-discrimination against our Indigenous people. The top 3 resources that I will use. The first one, it will answer the question, what are the other determinants of health in our Indigenous communities? Discrimination and intergenerational impact. The impact of residential school affects Indigenous people, mental health, and their wellness. Their resources for living are inadequate. Their housing, the lack of resources of food or for clean water, their sources of income or job to support their family's basic needs, the education for Indigenous youth. Those resources are inadequate in these communities. Second one, it will talk about how does the racism against Indigenous people affect their mental health and wellness. As it was mentioned in the previous slide, in this Indigenous community, suicide rates are increasing. And definitely, especially in Indigenous youth, suicide rates are 5 times to 6 times higher than non-Indigenous youth. And this is due to all forms of racism, intergenerational trauma, bullying, cyberbullying, lack of emotional support from their family or from the people around them, physical safety. It all contributed why suicide rates are higher in Indigenous community. Last one. In what ways can government help Indigenous community to have equal access in our healthcare services? First one, cultural safety for nurse and medical professionals. This will help shaping our healthcare practices, organizations, policies by identifying social justice goals. And it is technically essential. because healthcare system involve Indigenous people, and it can reduce discrimination and racism. TVIC, Trauma and Violence Informed Care. Healthcare professionals will provide care that is respectful and affirming to our Indigenous people, as well as non-Indigenous, recognizing the intersection of health effects of cultural and individual violence, and other forms of inequity. Understanding people's health and social issues in context are important, and the work to reduce retraumatization due to residential school and the violence that these Indigenous people have experienced. Contextually tailored care. This include services that are explicitly tailored to local communities and populations served. Tailoring practices to address the needs of local population and community relatives. For example, in Indigenous communities, what do they need? They need mental health support for the families who are suffering or who are dealing with intergenerational effects of residential school. And for the women, maternity support, supporting them how they can properly grow their kids. These 3 ways are important to improve Indigenous communities' health. And since we are talking about health, it is universal and it should be always available for everybody. My research report, it is irrelevant today. During the pandemic, because Indigenous communities should be provided with this care. And health care services should provide safety, help in their mental wellness, in their physical wellness. And yeah, that's everything for today. Thank you.